Right now, no deal exists. No partial deal exists. And unless Iran is able to make the difficult decisions that will be required, there won't be a deal. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That is the standard by which this negotiation is taking place, and anyone who tells you otherwise is simply misinformed.
With Miranda Khan, J.D. Hayworth welcoming you back to America's Forum. We just heard our Secretary of State, John Kerry, at the talks in Geneva saying, wait a minute, there is no deal, and that Iran has to agree with the U.S. if a deal is to be agreed upon.
Secretary Kerry spent Tuesday negotiating with Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, hoping to convince him to roll back their plans to make Iran a nuclear country.
So what's really going on in these negotiations? To discuss this further, we're so pleased to welcome to the anchor desk Ambassador Eric Javits, who is the permanent U.S. representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. Ambassador, it is great to have you here. The Secretary of State says that people are woefully misinformed. We assume he was referring to the Israeli Prime Minister addressing a joint session of Congress. Your take on what may be transpiring?
We don't really know what's transpiring, unfortunately. There isn't much transparency in this, but from what I've been able to glean, it looks like we're ready to trash the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the essential structure and groundwork of all arms control to try to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And many countries gave up their aspirations to become nuclear powers in exchange for the pledge that ultimately the few nuclear powers would ultimately disarm. And of course without any timetable, but that was the original intention. Every administration before this administration has aspired to have a fissile material cutoff treaty. It never happened in Geneva at the Conference on Disarmament when I was there. But it was the idea of not having any fissile material being produced any longer. Here we have fissile material that's being sought by Iran. When you go into a negotiation, the way you get a successful negotiation is to intuit or to discern the must-haves of the other side. Well, we look at Iran, which is aspiring to be the hegemon of the Middle East. We look at it from the standpoint of aspiring to have all the elements of a nuclear warhead mounted on an intercontinental ballistic missile. Just rolling back or delaying that will cause other states to jettison the idea of a non-proliferation treaty and to arm themselves, and we'll be in a mess with everybody having nuclear weapons. Sooner or later, that's going to cause a conflagration, but one which the world doesn't truly understand until it happens, and that's too late.
Why such a lack of transparency?
Well, apparently the negotiators that we have on behalf of the United States are not prepared to really make a red line, because the last red line they made on Syria, they crossed and nothing happened. So if you really announce too much, it becomes a red line, and then of course you cross it if you're desperate for a deal, which it looks like we are. If you're not prepared to walk away from the table, the other side immediately knows they can get what they want.
About a minute left in this segment, Eric. We've seen reports saying that the Iranians are getting 80% of what they want. Do you believe those reports?
Well, I think that America has intuited that they are aspiring to get the weapon, and if we want to have a successful negotiation, you have to allow them to have it. I'm sorry. That's how it appears to me.
Meantime, American interests are suborned to the desires of the Iranians?
Well,
20
we
seconds.
started out with the idea that they could never have a nuclear weapon, and that they could never make fissile material to the point where they could get that nuclear weapon. But we've done nothing about, in deterring it, really, in this negotiation. You have to walk away if you want to deter them.
Well, Ambassador, we don't want you to walk away just yet, because we want to continue this conversation. It is such an important issue that Ambassador Eric Javits will stay with us to talk about what is at stake and what may be playing out in a place he knows pretty well, Geneva. There's more to come here on America's Forum.
Keep in mind that when we shaped that interim deal, Prime Minister Netanyahu made almost the precise same speech about how dangerous that deal was going to be. And yet, over a year later, even Israeli intelligence officers, and in some cases members of the Israeli government, have to acknowledge that in fact it has kept Iran from further pursuing its nuclear program.
A somewhat irritated President Obama in a photo op following the speech by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to a joint session of our Congress with Miranda Khan, J.D. Hayworth. It was interesting, Miranda. The president said he didn't watch the speech, but he read the transcript. You sure got mad just reading the words.
He seemed a little fired up,
Well,
just a tad. You brought up a good point during the break, and I want to make sure that we have time to get to it, but you were saying
and
that...
let's reintroduce our friend Eric Javits, who is ambassador, who has negotiated on so many of these issues, including disarmament. And as Miranda was making the point here, diplomacy, words are often, they're euphemisms. But you've got a fairly stark assessment here. Yeah,
you were saying basically we need a change of command in Iran.
Well, I can understand the president and the administration's hope and aspiration that the mullahs would want to come back into the civilized community and try a peaceful approach to the world. But apparently we've given them the chance, and it doesn't look like their negotiators are backing away from the idea that they do have nuclear aspirations ultimately, and that there will be no restraint they will accept ultimately on their ability to have a nuclear weapon. Well, once you ascertain that, and it's irrevocably apparent, to me at least, it should be to our negotiators, then you have to decide whether or not you can deal with this regime, or whether there has to be regime change before you can get the must-haves that the free world needs for its own security. It's quite apparent.
And so, short of a regime change in Iran, the question is prompted, why even be involved in these negotiations?
Well, I think you'll see that it's either going to be that we have to walk away from the table, or the Congress will simply put thumbs down on whatever we've arranged, or unfortunately we will be dragged into a deal which ultimately will be to the detriment of the free world.
So do you believe what they've been saying all along, a bad deal is better than no deal? In your mind,
a bad deal is disaster. There's no other explanation, because if you go forward to the ultimate day, if it's 10 years, 15 years, or 20 years, when zealots of this type have the nuclear weapon, with their ambitions to recreate the empire, it's going to spell disaster. Every other country in that area will have weapons by that time.
We appreciate your plain speaking, Eric. Let me return to a euphemism discussing our own leadership.
Okay.
Given their insistent optimism that something can be worked out, you talked about Congress turning thumbs down. What about side agreements? We're already hearing about the formulation of, quote, secret side agreements. The LA Times reported extensively on those things. Do those notions of side agreements without the purview of Congress worry you?
Well, the small print worries me. Forget about the side deals. Forget about the cheating. The small print on what the IAEA can actually inspect and what can be done about it if the cheating goes on, which has always occurred. For the last 20 years, there hasn't been anything that Iran has committed to that they haven't cheated on. And North Korea is the perfect precedent, an example. So if you go with Reagan's formula of trust but verify, the verification has to be ironclad. You can't afford to have weak verification, which is what we've got.
Ambassador Eric Javits, you have been at the negotiating table for our country. We are grateful for your service as an ambassador. We're grateful for your time this morning here on the Anchor Desk. Thanks for being here.
Nice to be with you.
It's great to have you. Eric just mentioned Ronald Reagan. Coming up, was Benjamin Netanyahu's speech somewhat Reagan-esque yesterday? We'll talk about that and one of the unintended consequences of such a speech. Stay with us.